Welcome our Minister, Jean-Yves Duclos, Minister of Public Services and Procurement, to complete, I suppose, our study on defense policy update. I'll leave it to you, Minister, to introduce your colleagues with you and look forward to what you have to say for the next 5 minutes. And then on 5 minutes and 1 second, I think a door will open and something will happen. So thank you, Minister, for your appearance here.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm very pleased to be invited to your last meeting on this important topic. I suppose the last meeting is either less important or more important, depending on what preceded it. I'll do my best, of course, to be useful to the work of your important committee. And I'm accompanied today by Simon Page, Assistant Deputy Minister for Defense and Marine Procurement Branch, and Shaban Harty, Assistant Deputy Minister for Defense Procurement Review Branch. We all three thank the committee and recognize its important work. First of all, last week we marked 1,000 days of the unjustified and barbaric invasion of Ukraine by Russia. We reiterate Canada's unshaken support for Ukraine. We've supported Ukraine with $4.5 billion in military support. We've renegotiated our free trade agreement with Ukraine in order to better support the Ukrainian people in its fight for independence. 2 weeks ago, I was in Saint-Jean-sur-Richelieu, where we announced an acquisition contract with Rheinmetall for $374 million to better support our armed forces. My colleague, our colleague, the member of the committee, the member for Saint-Jean, was present at this important announcement, and I want to underscore her partnership for her community. I was able to have dialogue with forces members who participated with the Ukrainian forces in Lithuania. They told me how Canada's contribution for the training of Ukrainian forces who are fighting for their democracy made an enormous difference.
We need to invest in them. Our North, Strong and Free highlighted a new overall investment of $8.1 billion over 5 years and $73 billion over 20 years in defense spending, included in our budget 2024. With those investments, Canada's defense spending to GDP ratio, currently at about 1.4%, is expected to rise above 1.7% in 2029-2030 and to reach 2% of NATO spending by 2032. Our North, Strong and Free, a renewed vision for Canada's defense, reaffirms our commitment to reviewing Canada's defense procurement system. We have to think differently about defense procurement, and in the review, we're asking questions at every stage of the process, from how the Department of National Defense sets requirements right up to how quickly we can deliver new equipment while running open, fair and rigorous competitive processes wherever and whenever possible and preferable. We are reviewing the rules and regulations that govern military procurement, as well as the internal processes used to define requirements and approve projects. We're looking for ways to compress timelines for major government acquisitions without sacrificing due diligence, and we're working with our industry partners to change the way we consult with defense industry to adopt a more strategic approach. We also want to get smarter about how we invest in innovation and how we acquire and integrate Canada's innovations into CAF capabilities. Of course, we'll always support Canadian industry to be more globally competitive as new opportunities emerge in a rapidly changing defense market. De plus, nous allons collaborer plus étroitement.
And we're going to collaborate more closely with our allies on how we define requirements and how we develop new equipment and systems that support interoperability and strengthen our shared defense. Right now, we're currently working with other departments and agencies to review and reform our defense procurement processes so that we can better achieve these goals. These changes should be announced in months to come. In the meantime, we continue to advance key defense procurements on a number of fronts and as efficiently as possible.
Monday at the Canadian Global Affairs Institute Defense Procurement Conference in Ottawa, Minister Blair and myself announced that we're entering negotiations for a strategic partnership with L3 Harris for the F-35 airframe maintenance depot. That strategic partnership will allow us to be ready to do the maintenance of our new fleet of F-35 fighter jets once they start being delivered in 2026. In conclusion, investments in our Canadian Armed Forces, like the ones highlighted in our new defense strategy, is about making sure Canada can work with like-minded nations to uphold international rules and defend peace, justice and freedom while creating good middle-class jobs. Merci, Monsieur le Président. Et nous sommes maintenant.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We're now prepared to answer your questions.
Mr. Bazan, 6 minutes, please.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair and Minister and officials. Welcome you to the committee today in our study. Minister, in your procurement program, we know that a national defense employee, David Yeo, was also running a company called Dalian, and under the Arrive Can scam, his company got $7.9 million. Now, National Defense fired David Yeo. What are you doing to recoup that money that Dalian received? $7.9 million as part of the Arrive scam.
So thank you, Mr. Bazan. And let me point to another number when you point to defense procurement. It's less than 1%. That's what the former government invested in defense spending.
If you compare apples to apples, Minister, the parliament budget or the parliamentary library has just found out that actual spending, apples to apples, actual spending on national defense is at 0.95% this year. So you guys are below 1%. It's only with creative accounting that you get up over that when you add in veterans' pensions and Coast Guard and global affairs. So let's just move on for that, because I don't think that you guys have a leg to stand on. If you're not going to answer the question on recouping taxpayers' money from a scam like Dalian and Arrive Can app, let's just go on to a question I asked last year. We were talking about getting the shoulder-launched missiles for our troops in Latvia, and I asked if there had been any live-fire exercises and tests of and a shoot-off between the different systems that are out there, and D&D confirmed that there wasn't. Now we're hearing that the Spike LR2 system is having problems, and they're not as accurate as expected. So I'm asking is why weren't the options tested before we actually procured a system that doesn't work to the expectations of our armed forces?
So two things again, less than 1%. I know you don't like to hear that.
You're less than 1% too.
True.
Come on, let's just move
but
on.
The second thing is if you want to hear in more detail operational matters for D&D, I'm sure Minister Blair will be very pleased to come to you. I expect this meeting to center around the procurement activities that we need to do to support the armed forces. Obviously, these procurement activities are supportive of the needs of the armed forces, but also supportive of a more resilient and more competitive defense industry in Canada. We believe that when we invest in our industry, we also invest in our armed forces and support other allied countries at the same time.
So you have to fix it because, as we know, with the Spike LR2 system, it hasn't met expectations, and our troops are wondering why we didn't do the proper testing and procurement in that process. To move on, now we have the defense industry that employs all sorts of different types of people, and you signed a number of certificates of exemption from registration under the Controlled Goods Regulation, which is granted to citizens of Russia, the People's Republic of China, and Iran. And this is with industries that are developing sensitive military technologies. Do you believe it's a national security risk to allow foreign nationals access to those military sensitive technologies?
Well, first you spoke about Russia, and I think it's important to point to things that, unfortunately, I mean, you may not have agreed with that, James, that things that your party did in the House of Commons, which was to oppose every measure we put into place to support Ukraine in its war against the unjustified battle.
Ukraine, that's why. Like if you Politics, Mr. Chair. Let's actually have him answer the questions I'm asking.
It works better when you don't talk over each other. And whether the questions you are asking and the answers that he is giving, you're not able to direct. He's not able to direct your questions, and you're not able to direct his answers. So I'm going to turn to the minister and ask him in as short a time as possible to respond to Mr. Brzan's questions in the 2 minutes that he has left.
Yes, well, you did correctly speak to how we defend Ukraine against Russia, and that's exactly what we have done until now. Unfortunately, this is teamwork. No, we need to be every party in the House need to be aligned in supporting Ukraine against Russia, and unfortunately, this is not what we have seen recently, including on the free trade accord.
Supporting Ukraine, then let's make sure Russia doesn't get access to our military secrets. Since 2016, PSPC, as minister, has signed off on 190 citizens of China, 22 Russian citizens, and 4 citizens of the Iranian regime who are international students, temporary foreign workers, or visitors to Canada. And that's gave them access to military technology like jet engines, diagrams, blueprints, electronic countermeasures equipment, missile technology. You know, Section 5504 strategic goods is including, but not limited to, global navigation systems, things like that. So why would we allow our adversaries to actually enter into any defense industry, and you allowed it by giving those industries permission to have 199 citizens of the People's Republic of China, 22 Russians, and 4 Iranians access to our military defense industry?
I'm sorry, MP Bezin, I don't accept the premises of your various questions. You're stating a number of facts which are inaccurate. It may be because you have been misbriefed or didn't have the opportunities to get the proper security clearance that you would need to know and understand those information. But what I would point
I've actually asked for security clearance, and of course the government is saying, you don't need to know, Brzan, so I'm not going to get a security clearance.
Respond to your question.
Now, talking about the equipment that matters so much, and I think you're correct to point to that. Now, with the announcement we made in Budget 2024, we are going to head to the 2% NATO target that is so important to Canada. This being said, and we know you don't like to hear that, but we were investing less than 1% of our GDP in defense spending prior to us coming into power. We've increased that to 1.4% now. It's going to go to 1.8% in 2028 and then ahead to 2% by 2032. These are tangible things that we need to do to support our military.
The enthusiastic question and answer session.
La séance de questions et de réponses fort enthousiaste s'ensuit de celle de Mme Landra-Poulos. Merci, Monsieur le Ministre, d'être présent pour répondre à certaines de nos questions. Nous apprécions votre présence dans la politique de défense ainsi que dans le budget 2024. Nous sommes engagés à examiner le processus de passation de marché du Canada. Pouvez-vous nous expliquer ce qu'a révélé cet exercice et comment nous pourrions améliorer le processus?
Emanuela, thank you for asking it. There are a number of objectives, and let me go through them quickly. The first one, the most important objective, is to meet the needs of our armed forces. Now, they need the support that they require to be there for Canada and Canadians across the world. We need to do that in a more timely and a more strategic manner while we protect the rigor of our system, because at the end what matters is the right equipment at the right time in the right way for our military. As we do that, the procurement reform will also make sure that we develop the resilience and the capability of our defense industry sector in Canada. We need that because other countries are also facing similar challenges when it comes to delivering the right equipment at the right time. And one example of that, a brief one that I would point to, is a recent accord with Finland and the United States. It's called the ICE-PAC. The ICE-PAC is a tremendous example of what Canadian industry can support, how Canadian industry can support the needs, in this case, of the armed forces and the Coast Guard, while supporting the needs of Finland, the United States, and many other allied countries in the world on ice-breaking capability. This is an incredibly important example of how we can do things more quickly and more collaboratively with our industries and with allied countries. A recent example that I mentioned briefly in my opening remarks is the announcement around L3 Harris. L3 Harris is a very important industry player in the defense sector in Canada. The fact that they now will be able to work strategically with us in the weeks and months to come is going to enable not only them to develop a national depot for the soon-to-come F-35, but also open up the opportunity for the United States to partner with us to have a regional North American depot for airframe maintenance in Canada for the F-35.
Thank you so much for that. And you actually went into what my next question would have been, but I'll pick your brain a little bit more. So you spoke to promoting our defense ministry to our partners as well. And you just mentioned a very specific example of where that was done and how our industry will be helping with the icebreakers. I'm wondering, what your thoughts are on our own relationship with defense industry. I know that you recently spoke to the importance of this relationship and improving it and changing it in ways that that we haven't necessarily seen that kind of cooperation in the past. What are your views on what needs to be done in order for us to work in partnership with industry in order to make sure that we meet the needs of our Canadian Armed Forces and defending our country?
It's an excellent question, and some of the answers appear in the report which this committee tabled in June 2024. The number of important recommendations, and I'll just point to two of them, a couple of them, 15 and 17, which are recommendations on the importance to develop sovereign industrial capabilities here in Canada. That must be done in a manner which is obviously connected to issues like interoperability, working with allies. So it's not only investing in the Canadian industry and in a sovereign context, but it's also, again, connecting to the things that, in terms of exchange of information, securing contract exchanges, we're both within Canada and across with our allies. So these you point to in the report. Another set of things that you point to in the report are recommendations 12 and 13, where when you indicate that a more modern procurement system using electronic means like the electronic procurement system, which we've put into place in recent years, the Canada Buys platform, which is an open, transparent, and easily accessible platform. These are all sorts of things which we believe will support the procurement reform that we need to put into place.
Thank you. I know that I've spoken quite a bit to the industry, because a lot of them are in my riding, a lot of companies are in my riding, and I also am one of the co-chairs of the aerospace industry group. And so I'm wondering, they've spoken about an aerospace strategy in terms of aerospace, and I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on what that could look like, if you support that type of strategy, and whether or not you think we should be working in partnership early enough on to kind of determine what will be the needs in the next 10 years to come, for example, or longer.
Well, and very briefly, great national shipbuilding strategy, the defense industry strategy that we are connecting to this morning, and the aerospace strategy, which is so important for lots of businesses and workers in your riding, Emanuela.
Madame Lambropoulos, Madame Normandin, 6 minutes, please.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Mr. Minister. We're pleased to see you here today and see you again after having seen you in Saint-Jean-sur-Richelieu for a great announcement. Another preamble for my first question. Many of the complaints we hear from industry when they come discuss procurement is that there are too many departments involved, and it doesn't seem that defense is a priority for this government. It's in that framework that the committee submitted a recommendation under which you personally answered that the Government of Canada is creating a secretariat within the Privy Council regarding everything regarding defense. So to reduce the number of departments and at least centralize decision-making and make sure it's a priority. Your answer said the government recognizes that an organization that groups together all those involved is important. You referred to something that was proposed in 2014. We didn't get the impression there was much movement, though, when it comes to the creation of a committee within the Privy Council office. Well, two things quickly. Thank you for the excellent question. First of all, that strategy of reform of procurement goes back too far, 2014. That's why we're putting one in place now. And your contribution, that of the committee, is very important in that regard. I have Shaban here, who knows Privy Council very well and understands very well the way the departments involved are. There's SPAC, National Defense, and the Department of Industry and Innovation that's involved. Those people already work well together. There may be something else in the coming months. Shaban, if you wish. Microphone, please. Three departments work together. There's a governance system that dates back to 2014, as you said. But we find that it works, but we can always improve the processes. And that's why we're examining the governance system. Thank you very much. As a witness, we received Philippe Lagacé, who mentioned that there's a tendency to underestimate procurement requests. It might be better to go through Treasury Board. We end up with projections that are quadruple warships, 26 billion to 100 billion. Philippe Lagacé said, well, often this is to allow for approvals, and then you either have to split up a contract and do only a part of it, or we end up without enough funds. I asked Ms. Beck what her opinion was. She said, well, it's difficult, essentially, to evaluate defense spending. Do you agree with that opinion by Ms. Beck, or is there really a problem in chronic underestimation of defense requirements? Well, thank you. What I would say, when we hear expert public servants around the table, but there are many others, that it is very difficult indeed to predict the exact amounts that will be needed to go forth with procurement projects that are often very complex. They do what they can at the outset. There are often additional needs that weren't noted at the outset because once the work starts, you notice that certain equipment that was produced for other countries don't really correspond to Canada's needs. Canada's a huge country with a huge land mass, very different from what we find elsewhere on the planet. So it regularly happens, not always, of course, unfortunately, but sometimes the amounts estimated at the outset are different from the amounts needed later on, given the Canadian context, which is highly different than what we find outside the country. But is an increase of 4 times normal? Well, of course, it depends on the particular context. As you said, we have to act with celerity, but we also have to act rigorously from a budget point of view, and adaptation to the needs of the Canadian Armed Forces, too. It's an essential relationship. We have to ensure that the interests of taxpayers are respected and recognized, but also ensure that the needs of the Canadian Forces are understood by the federal administration. Thank you. In the defense update, one of the priorities is the acquisition is land-based air defense, but that was promised to the Ukrainians in January 2023, 2 years ago, took 2 years to be delivered. What's being done to ensure that we can respond to this update and this willingness to acquire air defense within reasonable deadlines? Well, that's a good question. It's a result of our dependence on suppliers who are often outside of Canada. Canada can't do everything when it comes to production of equipment, but we can do some and we can do more. As I was saying a few moments ago, allies also have production challenges for the necessary equipment for their armed forces. It happens that these countries cannot react sufficiently quickly to the needs of the Canadian government for our armed forces. So that's why in your riding we had an opportunity to do this. That's why we have to invest more in the capacity and resilience of the defense industry in Canada.
Please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Minister, and the department officials. So, just to clarify, because there's been a few things spoken about, and I'm certainly very committed to ensuring that we use taxpayers' dollars for the procurement that we are seeking, but within Canada, so that it has the best possible outcome to ensure we have good Canadian unionized jobs. There are great examples of what we've done in terms of, even in my own riding with the light armored vehicles, but there are also examples of not going along that path. So first of all, I'd like to ask for clarification. The machinists union in Quebec, they wanted further clarification, or they were demanding that within the maintenance and the future maintenance of the F-35s, that they be considered or awarded that contract to continue to be able to do the work. So you had mentioned this L3 Harris regional depot. Can you expand on that just in terms of the ask from the IAMAW in terms of the jobs for those maintenance workers specifically?
Thank you for the great question. Indeed, what we announced on Monday meets many of these objectives. So the L3 Harris National Depot also has an opportunity to transform itself into a regional depot for the airframe maintenance of the F-35, the 88 F-35, which we are procuring and which we will start receiving in 2026. So it's an excellent example of a strategic relationship which, as you said, supports good, strong middle-class jobs, many of them unionized, while developing a resilience and a capability in Canada that will be important for the United States, which need according to what we hear from them, which need our help in maintaining the F-35 on their side as well. We are a big continent. We are allies, and we need to support each other. And that collective support also takes a place, also takes a form, as you suggested, of supporting middle-class jobs in Canada.
And those specific machinists, those from the local at IAM?
Oh, yes, and tons of others too, because the L3 Harris is connected to loads of other countries across Canada and in sectors that are not exclusively supportive of the defense sector, also supportive of other industrial sectors of our economy.
Okay. One of the concerns that we also had, we've heard that Canada makes incredible water bombers, and yet we haven't procured those made on the West Coast for a lot of the emergency firefighting issues, of course, that we've had, the emergencies that we've had in Canada. Can you talk about that?
That's a great question. Simon, are you ready to answer that question?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. So the water bombers are not a PSPC Defense and Marine procurement. We're very aware of the company that is involved in the fabrication of water bombers, but we don't manage that requirement in PSPC.
And why is that?
Because it's not Defense and Marine, Mr. Chair.
So you won't answer it here, and yet it's still a Canadian requirement in terms of emergency services, a lot of which our Canadian Armed Forces are a huge part of.
Yeah, it has no direct link with the Defense and Marine procurement branch of the department.
All right. In February of 2022, Minister, you received you received a response for the Canadian-made option for the replacement of the CP-140 Aurora aircraft under Canada's multi-mission aircraft. The bid there appeared at this committee during our study on procurement. They told us that the communications with your office went silent after that date. So if it was always assumed that this would be a sole source American option for this plane, why was that not stated from the get-go?
For two reasons. The first reason is that we needed those aircrafts in the very short term, and the only possibility to do that was to acquire them through Boeing. Otherwise, we would have been left with a lack of capability that the armed forces judged to be very critical. The second reason is that this type of procurement comes with industrial and technological benefits obligations. In the case of that particular procurement, there are approximately 3,000 jobs that are supported through the obligations that Boeing has towards the Canadian industry, and it adds up to about $350 million of GDP output because of Boeing's obligations to Canadian workers and the Canadian industry. So the ITB ensures that when we're obligated to work with foreign suppliers, as in this particular case, to support the needs of our armed forces, that comes with an obligation on the part of the company to support industry and workers through the ITB policy.
Bombardier was very, very clear, however, with this committee that they knew that they could meet those obligations just as quickly. They had everything in place, and yet they felt that they were left out entirely, that they weren't communicated with, and that this was looked at as a sole source contract.
Right at the time where it expires. So if you can work your answer back into some other response, do so. Meanwhile, we move on to the next round. And Mr. Stewart, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Minister, for being here today. I just want to get one thing on the record here. What I have here is an answer from Charles Souza, your parliamentary secretary, that shows that there were 199 citizens of China, 22 Russian citizens, 4 citizens of the Iranian regime who are either international students, temporary workers, or visitors, allowing them access to things like blueprints, diagrams, and software on military jet engines, aircraft, FLIR, avionics, missile technology, and electronic countermeasures equipment. I can show that to you later if you like. I want to get that on the record, Chair. I was looking up.
Do you have a copy for the minister by any chance?
We can get one to him.
And they too.
I was researching some procurement initiatives this morning, and it was funny. The first thing that popped up was an ad. Discover the cure for bad service management. And that led me down a little bit of a rabbit hole, and it got me thinking about the procurement times that we have for some of our equipment for military use. Over 7 years to buy tow trucks. That one caught my interest. Over 10 years to buy drones. Meanwhile, we've seen rising threats from China and Russia, which would suggest that these timelines for military procurement should be compressed to weigh against the threats. Now, I understand that in procurement, there's an element of risk management to be, whether it's financial risk management or equipment risk management. But at the moment, the risks seem to be tilted towards those of the soldiers because they're not soldiers and airwomen, airmen, and sailors because they're not getting the equipment they need in a timely manner. Can you explain to me how we can improve our procurement system such that our CAF members can get equipment that their life depends on in a more timely manner?
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Vous avez correct.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Once again, you correctly pointed to the importance of affiliating our armed forces, but you invested less than 1% in the armed forces before 2015.
Levels of investment, and I'll get on the record here as well, that the GDP numbers of our government are also been fudged. The DPU put forward numbers that were based on not the government's GDP forecast, but their own, which undershot to show that there was a higher defense spending of 1.76. If you back that back out, it's well below 1.5% in actual fact.
That was basically, it's been 3 minutes of Mr. Stewart's question, so it seems only fair to allocate the balance of the time however you wish to answer the question.
Très bien. Deux choses. On parle.
Two things. We're talking about 2015 spending. In 2015, it was less than 1% of the GDP invested by the Conservatives. Then there's risk management. You're perfectly right. We have to manage risk in a way that guarantees that the forces will have the equipment they need. So we have to accelerate the processes, and that's what we're trying to do, among other things, with the announcement I made last Thursday with Eldred Harris. That was very well received. There will be other announcements very soon about this strategic partnership, and it gives results. There are 200 additional aircraft, 9 in the last 2 years alone, which is more than in very many years preceding that. We're talking about investment in the shipbuilding strategy, dozens of ships, icebreakers that protect our coasts and our seas. So these are significant elements of progress, but can only be done if we have the money necessary to do it.
Thank you. When we had General Leslie here a few weeks ago, he said that in 2023, Canada spent more money on consultants and professional services than it did on the Army, Navy, and Air Force combined. Would you suggest that, or would you agree that this was a misuse of money, and why are these funds not being directed towards our troops?
À nouveau, il faut regarder les chiffres.
Well, once again, you have to look at the figures as they are. It was less than 1% in 2015. We're now at 1.4%. We will approach 1.8% in 2028, and we'll achieve 2% in 2032. So these are very clear figures, and the trend is obvious. While we have this increase in the budget for the forces, we have to make sure that the needs of the armed forces are fulfilled. We have to support Canadian industry, too, in its competitiveness, in order to have a partnership with the U.S. Industry. The example of IcePac for the naval strategy works very well. We can provide Canada with icebreakers that other allied nations also need.
Mr. Collins, 5 minutes.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. And Minister, good morning. Welcome to the committee. I want to talk about Ukraine. And you recall this time last year we had those marathon votes in Parliament around the budget. And you and your team were responsible for following through on our commitment to provide support for the Ukrainian people. And you know, I'm going to ask you some questions maybe that the opposition should be asking, but we know that the Conservative Party, since last year when their leader advised their caucus to vote against resources for Ukraine, they don't ask questions anymore at this committee. And last year...
Point of order. Well, Mr. Chair, Mr. Collins knows so well that the Conservatives have lost confidence in this government for a long time. Those are confidence motions. We'll vote non-confidence in the Liberals every chance we get. So...
That's a point of interruption.
I would suggest we give him
Just-
time to restart.
So, Minister,
Mr. Collins?
it's interesting
Mr.
because
Collins.
when I... Yes, sorry.
Mr. Collins. Okay, I don't mind entertaining points of order, but when they're just simply points of interruption, it's not particularly useful. So
I agree.
You have 4.5 minutes left.
Thank you.
Please.
So, Minister, last year when I raised this issue after the Conservatives voted against all resources for Ukraine, they actually came to the committee with the procedural book and went through some of the procedural items in the book that prohibited our members from highlighting the fact that they voted against Ukraine. I say that only because I think it's important that we get it on the record that as we go into an election next year, that there are some pretty stark differences in the policies that our government has and positions that our government has related to the Conservatives. And we support Ukraine. And you and your ministry play a key role in ensuring that the Ukrainian people receive the resources that they need. Can you relay to the committee what role your ministry is playing? And I know that you keep track of all those investments online, and I look at them quite regularly, and it looks like almost 90% or more of what we've committed has been delivered. Can you expand upon that?
Thank you, Chad. And it is indeed perhaps not enjoyable for some MPs to say things clearly. No, not only are Conservative MPs not wanting to speak about these things, but they are forced not to do so by their leader. Now, that's their issue, perhaps, but the problem is that this brings stark differences leading to the next election, as you are pointing to. They'll have to answer to Canadians why they are saying so many good things about the armed forces, but have invested less than 1% of their GDP on the armed forces prior to 2015. They'll have to explain why they voted against every possible investment we made in support of the Ukraine in the last year or two. They'll have to explain that. They'll have to explain why they voted against a free trade agreement that was there to support Ukraine, and they all voted against that, although we know that many of them would have liked to vote in favor, but they were forced by the Conservative leader not to do so. So that's for them to say. What we can say, however, is that we have invested $4.5 billion in supporting Ukraine. We have trained and helped train F-16 pilots and help support their maintenance workers, the Ukrainian maintenance workers that are so important in maintaining those F-16 pilots. We have invested $650 million for advanced and highly needed armored combat support vehicles. These are all examples, and many others, of examples of things that unfortunately, and we know they don't want to speak about that, unfortunately Conservative MPs voted systematically against, not because perhaps they wanted to do so, because they were forced to do that.
How much time? Oh, perfect. Minister, I'll get to the 1% of defense spending of GDP. You referenced that the Conservatives, when we inherited the file as a government, it was around, I think it was 0.9 actually.
0.95 right now. Okay. Mr. Bazan, points of interruption, whether they are on the record or off the record, are still points of interruption. I haven't heard many interruptions from this side. I expect no interruptions from that side. So, Mr. Collins, we'll go back to 30 seconds.
You mentioned the pathway to 2%. Do you want to provide more information in terms of how we correct the budget situation that the Conservatives left our government in back in 2015?
It's a fact. It's less than 1% in 2015. It's part of the public accounts. There's nothing to hide. We know it's uncomfortable for others, for some MPs, Conservative MPs, to speak about that, but it's a fact. It's written in the public accounts. Now, as we move forward, we know we'll be achieving 1.4% in 2026, about 1.7 and a bit beyond in 2028, and 2% in 2032. But the numbers matter. But the impacts for our armed forces are even more important.
I'll be interested in this one. Yes, Mr. Stewart.
The 1.76 is already disputed. Doesn't follow the government's current numbers.
It's a point of debate, not a point of order. Please continue, Minister.
So we all feel the lack of comfort around those numbers. But when things are true, it's important to state that, because Canadians will have to make a choice in the next election, whether they want to believe fake news and fake numbers around investments in 2015 on the armed forces, whether they want to make progress towards the achievement of that 2% NATO target, for which we have a path and for which we have demonstrated success over the recent years.
Okay, thank you, Minister. Long 5 minutes. Madame Normandin, 2.5 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Ms. Normandin, 2.5. I don't want to add fuel to the fire, but there's also the parliamentary budget officer who reviewed the figures. Now, having said that, I'd like to hear your views on the industrial policy that we've been waiting for, especially when it comes to defense, because there are complaints by the industry to the effect that it's difficult to communicate with various departments. What we also hear is there seems to be a tendency to go to the lowest bidder without taking into account the capacity of Canadian businesses or external companies to offer services with local production. So I'd like to hear you on that. Is that part of your plans to review procurement systems to give different points when the company wants to settle here and produce here, even if it's a little bit more expensive and not necessarily the lowest bidder? Thank you. Once again, very good question. There are strategic considerations that are more and more important. One of those considerations to which you're alluding is resilience of our industry in Canada, including, of course, the Quebec industry. We have to have a more resilient industry and agile in the coming years because there will be additional needs. With the geopolitical environment we live in that's very complex, there will be additional needs for the Canadian industry to support the needs that are evolving for technology, for our armed forces. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there are also many allies who will need Canada more and more to support their own needs and support their capacity to deploy in different regions of the planet. So that criterion of resilience, building our Canadian industry, has to be taken into consideration more and more by the Canadian government. And an example of that is the announcement last Monday with L3Harris in Mirabel that works with hundreds of other companies throughout Canada. That's an example of a strategic choice. We think that that's the best cost-value ratio. Not only do we think that's the case, but by investing in this company and other Canadian companies, we'll achieve the objectives that you summarized so well.
It's over 2:30. My goodness. 2.5 minutes, Ms. Madsen.
Thank you, Minister. So during our study on procurement, we heard a lot about the problematic relationship with transparency within the federal government's procurement, in that it's over-reliant on the national security exemption to skip through a combination of valid checks and balances, which are seen potentially as bureaucratic steps. If the system for procurement is broken and requires an exemption to get procurement decisions, why can't the government reform the process in a way that retains that transparency in an open process instead of continuing to file those national security exemptions?
Okay, thank you. Now, there is an obvious link here to national security, of which there would be a ton of things to say. I'll ask, I think Simon is the best person positioned to speak about how those security clearances are granted. No, I was in Washington with other colleagues in May. I spoke directly with the U.S. administration about the importance for the Canadian industry to work in a secure manner with the American government in order to be able for the Canadian industry to have access quickly in a secure manner to the information that they need to have access to outside contracts. So, Simon, would you like to expand a bit on that?
Oui, merci beaucoup pour la question, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chairman.
My minister just said, so the national security exception is a provision that is found in most of Canada's domestic and international trade agreement. It does allow us to exclude some procurements from the obligations that we would find in these trade agreements. The Department of National Defense and the Canadian Forces, they must only invoke the national security exception if compliance with a trade agreement could be expected to pose a risk. Many of the procurements that are facing us at the moment are overlapping with that risk. So we value them, we evaluate them, and case by case, we provide an agreement or support for the national security exception. I must say I reviewed them all personally for all the defense and marine procurement. They are well justified, and if you look at today's world and today's environments, there are a lot of risk out there. So it makes sense in many of our procurements to apply it. Maybe two more things. The application of the national security exception.
I'm sorry, Madame Madsen, another time, but those probably are important two things. Madame Gallant, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Germany is considering invoking NATO's Article 5. You won't have our submarines operational for another 13 years if all goes well. In 5 years, our Conservative government got 5 C-17 Globemasters, 17 C-130 Hercs, 15 Chinook helicopters, which had been canceled by the Liberals previously and ended up costing many lives on the ground in Afghanistan, 100 Leopard tanks, modernized drones, modernized Auroras and frigates. So we don't have 13 years. We're on the potentially the brink of war. What can you do to speed up the process now so that we can get the equipment in our military's hands that they need right now on the front lines?
Well, two things. First, I have a long list of investments that we've made just in the last few years. I can speak to the Future Fighter Capability Project, the Canadian Multi-Mission Aircraft, the Arctic and Offshore Patrol Ships, the Armored Combat Support Vehicles, the Logistics Vehicle Modernization Project, the Strategic Tanker Transport Capability, the Remotely Piloted Aircraft System, and I could go on and go on. But one thing I could summarize in just one number is less than 1%. This is what the Conservative government invested in 2015. We've reached 1.4% and will achieve the 2% NATO target in 2032.
In 2013, or in 2032, the NATO target could be 3%. In fact, they're looking at raising the base, the floor, to 2.5%. So already you're more than a decade behind. Now, over Thanksgiving, I met with several local manufacturers of military kit. I asked how quickly they could ramp up if we needed to. They said U.S. defense contractors had just been there asking them the same questions. So what they told me is that all they need are the contracts. So what volume of artillery shells, ammunition have been put into contracts, missiles, have the contracts actually been signed for? What can you tell me is on order to be ready should the worst happen?
Merci. Donc, à nouveau, moins de...
Thank you. Again, less than 1% in 2015. And when it comes to munitions, in the new policy announced a few months ago, we have a budget of about $9.5 million for new production capacity in Canada, not just munitions produced in Canada will be used by the Canadian forces, but a significant amount will come from Canada because we know that in Quebec, Saint-Augustin, Valleyfield, Repentigny, in Winnipeg, in Magellan, Ontario, Kitchener, other places, there is capacity for munition production that is underused right now and that we will be developing more to protect ourselves against the threats that you've properly identified.
Capacities exist, but they're not going to tool up and get ready until the contracts are in place. We have to be ready for when they need it. You've talked a lot about investments that you've made, but they haven't been delivered, and there's no sign that they're going to be delivered anytime quickly. So we have our troops in Latvia right now. Half their vehicles don't work. They don't have the parts. They don't have the mechanics. They have no air defense. What has been done on the part of your ministry in procuring some air defense that we can get on the ground for Canada, not borrowing off someone else?
Bon, je vais corriger certains faits, là.
Well, let me correct a few facts here. The Canadian defense industry is doing well and going better and better. 81,000 jobs are created in Canada annually with a significant investment that we're making. The second thing is that when you talk about presence in Latvia, it's to defend Ukraine. Unfortunately, I know it's uncomfortable for you to hear, but you voted against all investments that we made to defend Ukraine in the past few months. That's something we find regretful, but that's the reality.
Much. In response to my last question, I guess the answer is that there are no contracts for artillery shells or ammunition underway and in place so that we can get them in good order. So how are you going to provide enough funding and get the equipment necessary, cut through the red tape so that our cyber command has the necessary tools and latest technology and can keep up with the bad actors who are constantly attacking our cyber infrastructure from the cyber angle?
Again, I don't know why members do this, but runs a question right up to 3 seconds left. If you can answer in 3 seconds, you're welcome to it, but I'm happy to move on as well.
Less than 1%.
Okay.
Point of order. This is committee, Mr. Chair. It is not question period. We don't need the theatrics. We actually need some answers.
Well, yes, point of order. Man, this is a stretch of point of orders. Okay, final 5 minutes if we can get through this. Ms. Lapointe.
Chair. Bienvenue, Ministre.
Welcome, Minister. In context of increasing international complexity, it's important to have a stable procurement system and chain. Can you explain how our government is cooperating with Canadian industry to provide our Canadian forces with the resources they need while developing our economy?
Lapointe, I'm having troubles hearing your question, and I'm the closest one to you. I'd ask that this side at least keep their conversations somewhere over there. With that, Ms. Lapointe, please continue.
So, could you provide information about how the government cooperates with Canadian industry to provide the Canadian forces with the resources they need while developing local economies? Thank you very much. Excellent question, Viviane. 3 steps here. We invest a lot more than what the Conservatives did at the time. We invest in a strategic manner with strategic partnerships with Canadian industry. An important example for your riding is everything we're doing when it comes to maintenance of equipment, like the F-35s. You can't build them entirely in Canada, but we can offer Canadian partners the opportunity to maintain them. Maintenance contracts are often of greater value than the original procurement contract. And the last thing I'd add is that this works for the armed forces too. We have a lot of new aircraft bought in the past few years, 200 in the past 2 years alone. We're renewing the entire fleet of the Coast Guard, significant contracts that help Ontario shipyards. This has impact on middle-class jobs, 81,000 jobs for the middle class in Canada, many in your riding. So this is concrete action for workers and industry that produce concrete results for the members of the armed forces that need those investments to do their job here in Canada and around the world.
Defense procurement also serves as an opportunity to support Canadian industry and also Canadian innovation. How does the new policy integrate the procurement process with domestic industrial capabilities, especially advanced manufacturing? And can you share how your department will work to ensure that Canadian businesses are the ones that benefit from these opportunities?
That is so key and so important to do. So you would have noticed in the last hour or so that many of the things we're doing now are strategic in the sense that they support the strategic needs of our armed forces, the strategic needs of our industry players, many of them in your area, and the strategic needs of other countries as well, because other countries need us, including the United States. We can't do as well as the United States on all possible fronts. They are a much bigger country, but we can strategically be helpful to them in some key sectors. I mentioned the F-35 airframe depot just a moment ago. I mentioned the ice pack, the collaboration that we have on ice breaking, the construction of icebreakers in the decades to come. They need us because on building icebreakers, they are in more dire circumstances than we are in Canada with the important investments we've made in the national shipbuilding strategy. So these are examples of strategic investments, strategically supporting our armed forces, but strategically supporting our industry and strategically supporting our relationships with other countries, and in the U.S. in particular.
Okay. And given your department's central role in defense procurement, which I know we've already discussed here, could you highlight some of the key initiatives in our North, Strong and Free that will enhance the operational readiness of the Canadian Armed Forces?
That's a great question. Minister Blair would be better able to address the whole range of, and there are many of them, of aspects in which we are supporting better our armed forces. From my procurement perspective, let me point to the ammunition program, of which we talked earlier, and that's so important, the fact that we, for too long, have depended too much on the productive capabilities of other countries. So the $9.5 billion that we are investing in supporting the production of ammunition over the years to come in Ontario, in Manitoba, in Quebec, and elsewhere. This is one of many other examples of progress that our recent defense policy update is enabling us to make.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. I don't know, Minister, how much heat was generated and how much light was generated. There seems to be a dispute as to which was heat and which was light, but nevertheless, there is a core issue here, and it was highlighted by some of our attendants in Halifax and others' attendants in Montreal in this past weekend, and that is that procurement in a number of countries is moving to war footing, because the perception is that certain countries have to be ready for invasion. And I appreciate that every nation operates according to its perception of threat. My sense is that our, meaning Canada's perception of threat, is not as heightened as, frankly, the committee would prefer it to be. So I encourage you in your work. I appreciate that you find yourself in a difficult situation, but I think both our report and, how should we say, our questioning indicates that we need to really up the game here. I want to, again, thank you for your attendance here. But I also, before I let you go, I want you to participate in a recognition that one of our members, this is her last day with the committee. Madame Normandine is a very able and contributing member to our committee, and I personally will miss her questions. Not all of her questions, but most of her questions. And we have a little gift to recognize that this is her last day. You can tell us what you're going to be doing.
That's cute. C'est vraiment mignon. Il va avoir une place spéciale.
It'll have a special place in my office. Thank you very much.
All right. Okay, thank you very much. And we expect that some point or another you'll bring it back. You and it will return, and maybe someone else with you will come.
Most likely.
Okay, all the best on behalf of the committee. So with that, thank you, Minister. We are suspended, and we will resume as soon as possible. the witnesses, why don't you come closer together so that you... I'll do it at the end. Okay. Oh, true.
Just do it now.
Yeah. You want to move the motion? Okay. Okay, we are now on, and we have. I'm going to ask Mr. Bazan to move the supplementary.
Oh, you move it.
Okay, well, I'll ask it then. Is it the will of the committee to call the votes on the supplementary estimates?
Sure.
Yes. Shall the votes under Communication Security Establishment and the Department of National Defense of the supplementary estimates carry?
On division.
On division. Shall I report these votes to the House?
Report.
Okay. And we have do you want this budget done as well? There's a budget distributed on Thursday, February 21st, in the amount of $16,650. Would someone like to move the adoption of the study budget? Done. Okay. And one final thing, Mr. Collins has moved a motion, or tabled a motion, and there's an argument to be put that I think is a good motion, put it that way. There's an argument to be put, though, that it's not within the mandate of the committee. I just put that out there. I don't know whether the motion was not being moved at this point, but I just so that if that motion is to move forward, we move it forward within the mandate of the committee. So thank you, colleagues, for your cooperation. I'm anticipating bells. I don't know when they'll start and how that'll impact on our time. We've usually had kind of an understanding that we can go through bells for a number of minutes. Yeah.
So bells start, which will be sometime after 10 o'clock. It's a half-hour bell, is my understanding, so I think we could at the very least go till 15? Quarter after 10.
Yeah, I think we should be able to make it through. Okay. Okay, colleagues, with that, I'm assuming no opening statement. No. Mr. Allison, 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. My colleague, Ms. Normandine, asked the question of the minister in terms of when it comes to procurement and other departments, and we hear this all the time, the issues of silos, departments, and all those other kinds of things. It's a real issue. I mean, I've been here 20 years, and it's still an issue 20 years after I arrived. My question to you is, there's probably no easy answers to fix this, but do you have any suggestions in terms of what you would recommend based on your experiences on how we could streamline the process? And remember, once again, a lot of the concerns here is that, okay, when we finally do decide to move forward with things, either it takes another longer time or we got to go through the process. And so it takes many, many years when we find some of our allies being able to procure things in a quicker fashion. So once again, that's not a system you guys set up, but you're now part of it. You see it, you probably witness it every day. You're probably frustrated like we are as well. Any solutions for us or any thought processes on how we could do a better job as a government to be able to procure defense or procure anything really in a timely fashion? But we're here talking about defense, so we'll leave it to that.
So, thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. It's a fantastic question and really had the heart of the matter, I find, for this committee. So I actually personally chair the ADM level Defense Procurement Strategy Committee, and my DM, Deputy Minister Reza, she chairs the Deputy Minister level. I find I've been in the system now for a few years, and I go back to years where the three departments that need to be at the table to execute procurement were barely at the table. It was difficult to get them together. We now have a very sound governance system based on the 2014 Defense Procurement Strategy that has actually matured to a pretty good point at this time from a functionality point of view, from an effectiveness point of view. I think if I was going to identify one area where this governance could be improved is after things get to the Deputy Minister level, because we sit down on a regular basis according to specific agenda and we review projects that need specific decision according to procurement gates, would be an easier access to how to bring the procurement home from the final decision point of view. So that access to the minister layer needs to be improved. And hopefully, with the work that we're doing now, we'll be able to work this out.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. So I guess my another question as it relates to that then. So in terms of, you know, we've had some issues around the timeliness of being able to get things there. So is that because we've taken too much time to figure out what we want? You know, it seems like we appear as our allies are able to get things like kit, you know, in Lafayette and stuff like that, and we have a hard time procuring things like that. What are some of the challenges that we have to be able to deliver those things? Is it because we've committed money that we're going to get, you know, 20, 30 years from now, or maybe 10 years from now? Or is it maybe a question of like, how do we move this thing through the system? Like, once again, those checks and balances we talked about of being able to do that. And I look at, you know, the immediate needs that we need right now in Lafayette, and, you know, where are the bottlenecks in making that happen?
Yeah, again, thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question. It's another great question. And the engineer in me splits this procurement system in three portions: the pre-solicitation portion, the solicitation portion, and then which leads to a contract award, and then contract award and delivery of goods and equipment in most cases for us. I think to your question, the pre-solicitation is often underestimated because if you want to buy a plane or build a ship, you need the appropriate lead time. You cannot just turn around and expect a ship to be delivered in 2-3 years. You need the lead time. That lead time is sometimes misappreciated in the pre-solicitation activities. Within the solicitation activities, sometimes we underestimate also the complexity of the procurement and how things, for instance, in a shipbuilding project, the design phase is significant. And it does pay off to take a little bit more time in that design phase ahead of signing the big contract to build a ship. And then after contract award, where the accountability should really start, like the strong, rigid accountability should really start, then it's a partnership with industry, and we need to work better with industry. But that planning phase is also a phase where industry needs to be involved. And for me, we could do that better. I think to your exact point, sometimes, yes, projects will sit in what are we doing, which requirement do we really want phase, and they underestimate the time that's going to be actually required to deliver.
Okay. John, that's fine. Yep. A minute still?
You've still got a minute. Yeah.
Okay, good. All right, thanks. I guess the question in terms of how does, so what's the process then in terms of being able to address the critical gaps? Because we talk, you know, we look at sleeping bags, example for the last thing. How do you deal with the gaps in terms of what we ended up with versus what was required? Like, you know, where does that fall down?
Yeah, so the capability planning and the requirements come from the client department. So this would be a great question for the client department. They have a process to plan capabilities, to identify requirements. They have a specific panel, the independent panel on defense and procurement acquisition, that reviews all the requirements, and then the projects eventually come to us in PSPC for the pure execution of the solicitation process. So for me, for instance, let's take the submarines. We want a submarine in year X. Well, the procurement should get to us in X minus Y. And these two X and Y need to be really tackled properly and well. You would almost be thinking that for the big stuff the Canadian Armed Forces need, the big fleet, your fighter jet, your combatant at sea, your submarines, your maritime helicopter, that we would have a continuous capability planning cycle. Because as soon as you get the new aircraft, a few years later, it's time to think about the next one, especially in today's world. So it's a fantastic question, and for me, I don't want to say it's a pet peeve of mine, but I think if there's an area we could all collectively do better as a nation, is that planning phase ahead of things entering what I call the pure solicitation process box.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Allison. Point well taken. Mr. Pawlowski, 6 minutes.
I want to ask you about the national shipbuilding strategy. And currently, is Is that something that you're involved with?
Yes, thank you for the question, Mr. Chair.
Okay, so I do have a question, but I just wanted, before launching into the question, I thought I'd make sure that you don't come back with a response, well, it's not my department. Certainly, Irving, Davie, C-SPAN are part of that strategy in building bigger vessels. I know Ontario Shipyards, previously known as Heddle Marine, had wanted to be part of that strategy in building smaller vessels, which I gather the big three are not part of. I know they've had discussions, I think, with our government about that possibility. Can you kind of update me as to where we are with making them partners in this strategy?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. It's a great question. I mean, I'll start with a very precise, concise answer. Ontario Shipyards is our part of the National Shipbuilding Strategy. They actively contribute currently to Pillar 3 of the strategy, which is the repair and maintenance and refit layer. And there are certainly things that are coming.
Sorry, you said the repair rather than building new ships?
So that's where I'm going. So there are opportunities upcoming with specific project in the Pillar 2, which is construction of the medium-sized ship. So we have our large ship construction, which is Pillar 1. We have our smaller ship construction, which is Pillar 2. So there are a couple of projects that are coming down that will be Pillar 2 projects for which Ontario Shipyards will be able to compete for.
Can you give me a timeline for when that's going to happen?
Yes, I can absolutely do that. So the project, the most attractive project right now in that pillar 2, is the Midshore Multi-Mission Vessel for the Canadian Coast Guard, up to 6 of these vessels, and the request for information for this project has recently been published. So it's starting.
We've heard a lot in this committee about the prolonged length of time it takes for CAF procurement. And my understanding is that in procuring any particular item, it has to be signed off by 5 different departments. Why is that? And when I looked at which departments, one of them was Justice, which I was kind of scratching my head on that one. Like, why does Justice have to be involved in procuring for the Canadian Armed Forces?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. I think from a pure signature point of view, for a good portion of the procurements currently in play, 3 signatures are usually required. But many departments, including Justice, are involved in the process. So in the governance that I described earlier, the Defense Procurement Strategy governance, Justice has a seat. Every time we execute a procurement strategy for whatever the procurement is, it is assessed from a legal risk point of view. That legal risk is part of our Treasury Board submission and the greater assessment of the file.
Now, I know part of our party's platform in the 2019 election was to streamline the process. I know Minister Blair's talked about streamlining the process. What have we done in the last year or two in order to streamline it?
Yeah, and maybe I'll start and I'll give the floor here to my colleague, ADM Hardy. I just want to speak maybe as, again, the ADM who chairs the Defense Procurement Strategy and sees many of these procurements going through. The risk-based approach that we have implemented through a pilot a few years ago, and that we are now have a bit of an intent to keep going with it on a steady basis, is allowing us not to have to go to Treasury Board with full submission to execute project under the authority of my minister, Minister Duclos. This has enabled us to not only put more files through the mill, but also to accelerate the execution of some of these files.
Maybe I could add, so Simon had mentioned 3 different points at which we could look to optimize, and I'm just going to focus in on one that belongs to our department, and that is what we're developing different pathways for acquisition, recognizing that, acquiring a ship is different than acquiring a drone, yet we have a kind of one-size-fits-all approach, and so we are developing different pathways, recognizing that equipment varies, and so the different gates and processes for decision-making should vary as well. Thank you.
30 seconds.
Our government, I guess, has given Ukraine $4.5 billion worth of assistance in its efforts to fight their war against Russia. Given the kind of lengthy time it takes for procurement, have we done anything to accelerate that process? Because obviously, the Ukrainians want something sooner than 5-year process it takes to procure something.
The help, the donations, the assistance to Ukraine is a little bit of a different pipeline for us. Many of the procurements where equipment is sent to Ukraine is actually conducted under the CCC, so the Canadian Commercial Corporation. If it does impact our procurement, we will be involved. And there's a PSPC team also that does cost and price assurance. And sometimes they support the CCC in executing these contracts. But they're a bit out of the defense and marine portfolio.
Thank you, Mr. Pawlowski. I'm shocked that you would wish to cut lawyers out of a procurement process. I'm shocked. Yeah. Madame Normandine, 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci. Thank you very much, Mr. Page. Since it's your pet peeve, I'd like to continue with Mr. Allison's question about life cycle. I know there's a systematic analysis made for major acquisitions. I'd like to hear you about the weak point. Why is it that we can't really find the true amount? Is it because we don't involve industry enough in the analysis? Is it because we're not analyzing the best practices of other countries? Is it because we don't take into consideration the true life cycle? We know the production cycle is long. What is the weak point in these analyses? Thank you for the question, Mr. Chairman. That's quite a question, incidentally. The weak point, not necessarily just one. There's many points that need to be examined and improved. As my colleague, Ms. Hardy, said, there's a difference between establishing a price to build a ship or buying a drone that exists right now. For a major part of our acquisitions, the big things, let's say the Canadian Service Combatant, our big warship that we will be building in Halifax, I think you have to take into account that our practices have to change. We give a cost estimate to huge projects far too soon, not just the cost, but the schedule. We give the parameters far too early for projects that are more or less well evaluated. We had one price for this project, even a schedule, before we even knew which ship we were going to build. So it's not necessarily a weak link, but it's one thing where I'd like to see movement is high-level estimates. We have to plan this. The industry contributes to that planning. Could they contribute better? Maybe. But as we execute the solicitation to ensure that we remain responsible, give us the responsibility and the mandate to get the best value for money, best return on investment. That's our job as public servants. And give us a greater level of responsibility once the contract is signed. Because if you look at the price differences after the contract is signed and we know where we're going, there'll be differences, but they'll be more acceptable. if we start to look at what we said 7 years ago, when the first ship was still 6 or 7 years on the horizon, of course there'll be differences and gaps. There are things we will not have considered, like the pandemic. That was unpredictable. Inflation's hard to predict. Having said that, there are projects where when you buy a drone or a pistol, I think we do that quite well, but we could look at that with another vision with the involved industry. Very detailed answer. That's highly appreciated. Now, with the spin-off in technology for the industry, I'd like to see how we'd like to look at this again, dealing with indigenous companies, for instance. One complaint we heard is that there are indigenous companies that offer these finished projects, these products. Are there things that to look good on paper but don't work in practice? Once again, we could write a whole thesis on this. Thank you very much for your question. I would say that in governance, in the system we have right now, and this is something that was mentioned earlier, there are 3 major boxes we look. Technical, performance of the equipment we buy, we look at the cost and return on investment, and we look at a box that is economic spin-offs for Canada. Each of these boxes gets a number of points, and we execute the acquisition with a system which normally, for the vast majority, technical is more important, 50%, and 40-50% is left for the other 2 factors, because we buy equipment for the Canadian Forces. So it's important, that has imperative value from an operational standpoint. So the application of the policy, once again, I'll give the floor to my colleague here, but I think we could have some flexibility about how we apply this, depending on the acquisition strategy we had. If we have acquisition where we know it won't be a problem, this is something that Canada does and does well, we could give extra points for that. If it's something where we're very little involved, where it's very sophisticated, where the supply chain is well established, perhaps we could look for savings and economic spin-offs with more credibility. I'll just close with indigenous supplies. I come from defense. I remember days where this didn't exist in defense and marine. There was no overlap between indigenous companies and what went on in defense and marine. Now there's a lot. So I think that has to be looked at on a case-by-case basis where we have opportunities. And if there's a field where we have to examine what indigenous industry is telling us, that is one, because we have to understand what they can bring to our portfolio.
Madame Matson, 6 minutes.
So I know that after the last Conservative government, there was a huge loss of public servants. The current government tried to infill, but they infilled with contracting third parties out. And we've all seen what's happened with that, unfortunately. I wanted to ask about the filling in of those public servant positions. We specifically heard in an internal memo that roughly 4,200 military procurement positions were unfilled at the end of May 2022. And this is as we were told in the last study, really hurt. That loss of procurement specialists was a huge gap that needed to be filled. So can you give the committee an update on whether or not they have been filled, or what the plan is in place to fill those positions?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. And I think most of this statistic is probably with the client department, National Defense, the colleagues that that we deal with on a regular basis, and maybe also with other client departments such as the Coast Guard and Transport Canada. So the way it works for PSPC is that every time a project needs to come our way to execute a solicitation, the client department, the Government of Canada, through the client department, gives us the resources to hire the procurement specialist that we need to effect the procurement. So our organization, so that the key advantage of doing this is you capture all the costs associated with the project in one spot. On my side right now, on my team, I would say that we are well staffed to execute everything that's being asked in finishing strong, secure, engage, and tackling the on-staff requirements. Now, on-staff requirements, some projects are still being explored. So, for instance, I'm not fully staffed to execute the submarine, but I do have a very tiny team as the project grows and eventually gets executed. But I'm personally, my team here, executing the defense and marine procurement. We're lean, but we're good to go.
I'm glad that's a perfect segue because I was going to ask you about submarines next, actually. So can you share the scope of the spending on the new fleet of submarines compared to the rest of our Navy procurement projects? How much of that budget would be taken by this purchase as you understand it going forward?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. Really, right now, all the numbers are with the client department. So I'm not going to speak about any numbers or where this project could take us. The project has entered our bubble, if I may express myself this way. And what we've been asked so far is to start gathering some information. So a few weeks ago, there was a request for information that was published for this procurement. We have received 20-plus responses. The analysis has started. There'll be some back and forth with some of these folks, some of these companies that have answered. And at some point, the project will go through the approval cycle in national defense, and that's when some of the budgets, some of the funding pieces are going to start taking shape.
So I appreciate that. Unlike the national shipbuilding strategy, there's no clear domestic option for the purchase of the submarines in Canada. However, Canada is supposed to be, the government is supposed to be committed to ensuring as much domestic procurement as possible to ensure that Canadian workers are still benefiting from these very large scale, although you didn't give me numbers, procurement projects. So can you talk about the commitment on this specific project to the domestic workers, Canadian unionized jobs and workers?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. It's still very, very early with this project. We have received, as I mentioned, 20-plus responses for the request for information. Some of them are from Canadian shipyards and Canadian companies. We're just starting the analysis. It just closed, the request for information just closed a few days ago. And then after the analysis, likely, the shaping of your question will start being more tangible and concrete. At this time, I would say it's just too early to speak about specific contributions.
Okay. I know I have less than a minute left, Chair, and trying not to go over time because he'll get cranky with me. You were not allowed to finish the last question I asked you in terms of the national security exemptions, and you had 2 more points. Can you give those now?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. Two more points that I had on the national security exception is that once a national security exception is invoked, that doesn't mean that we stop adhering to the government contracting regulations. So GCRs, government contracting regulations, still apply even after the NSC has been invoked, and an NSC does not equal sole source procurement. So sometimes it may lead to a sole source procurement, but it is not an equal. It's not a mandated piece or a linked piece. And if I may, Mr. Chair, if you would allow me, water bombers, they are provincial procurement under the procurement system of provinces. So that's why they're not linked I wanted to confirm that before I table also one of your previous questions.
Thank you, Ms. Matheson, for not contributing to my crankiness. Rare occasion, yes, yes, yeah. Have a talent. We actually do have a full 25 minutes if we run this tight. Mr. Stewart, a tight 5 minutes, please.
Thank you. I'll also try not to contribute to your crankiness. Thank you to the witnesses for being here today. My question first just about general defense procurement. Is it lumped in kind of with the same processes as procurement for other departments? Or are there kind of some special considerations that D&D needs because of the national security element of it?
So if you're referring to our general rule set, so the answer is no. So it's all lumped in. So the government contracts regulations, which were referred to, cover all procurements.
Okay, and how do you prioritize which contracts or projects should receive? How do you prioritize whether it's looking at a new contract for munitions versus, say, the subs?
That's more clear.
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. That's a great question, and it is really the governance that I explained earlier, the defense procurement strategy governance, where 3 departments meet and we review various projects, various solicitations, is already prioritized according to the need and requirements of the client department. So it is that prioritization happens in their world. They have a program management board that they run within national defense that will dictate the pace and the priorities, and we try to obey that,
right.
that cycle.
At any time, you could have one thing bumped up ahead of another.
Absolutely. Okay. So, and that would be the case, for instance, for an urgent operational requirements, that I could ask my team to pause on one thing and execute a UOR.
When we're talking about the shipbuilding program and the subs, we're going to be able to procure subs and ships at the same time?
So thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. So the National Shipbuilding Strategy right now has 3 strategic partners, 3 large shipyards. They have programs of work that they have signed up to in their umbrella agreements under some specific terms and conditions that actually are going to be, I think, mirrored in what my minister was speaking about earlier about strategic partnerships. These program of work can be in motion at any one time, depending on government priorities. My assessment at this time is that the submarine project will come in, will be assessed from a capacity point of view, capacity domestically for maybe some sustainment, capacity internationally, and we'll be able to fit it in.
Okay, so when that project does ramp up, I know you said you have a nice tight team right now that's looking at the subs. How many more people do you think you're going to need to execute on that procurement?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. This will be a massive procurement. I'm comparing it early with the Canadian Surface Combatant. So the Canadian Surface Combatant, we started probably in the early days with a team of 15, 20. We're now around 40. So I would see the submarine probably going in a similar direction. Okay. Now, the team at DND will be a lot more numerous than mine. The head count will be a lot higher over there.
The Arctic offshore patrol vessels, are there lessons learned from that procurement that are directly applying to the procurement of the frigates that are going to help to kind of streamline and we can do continuous improvement?
Absolutely. Actually, it's one of our key discussion point with Irving Shipbuilding is make sure that the learning is implemented, and we're seeing results, by the way. And this project went through COVID. It survived COVID very nicely. But as we're going to launch in a few days AOPS number 6. It's been on a really good stream of delivery, and that delivery for me has integrated lessons learned, and some of those are definitely going into the Canadian Surface Combatant preparations as we expect to cut steel on the Combatant sometime in 2025.
Were there any RFIs or RFPs that were canceled as a result of the recent budget cuts in the D&D budget?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. As far as I'm concerned, in PSPC, and we run the RFIs and the RFPs. We have not canceled anything.
Okay. Okay. How long does it generally take? I mean, just with regards to the subs, you know, there's some RFIs that are in right now. When do you think actually the first purchase orders can be placed for a hull or something like that?
So thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. With all due respect, I'm not sure if I want to answer that at this time. It is too early. We barely have the high-level parameters of the project. So I'd like a bit to my earlier point that sometimes we're too early in putting parameters around the project. I don't think we're in a space to do this at this time.
Thank you.
Speculate. Madame Lambropoulos, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to you both for staying on to answer some more of our questions. Mr. Page, I heard you say that something that we could improve on is better planning and forward thinking so that we, you know, meet our goals quicker and work together with partners. I guess I'd like to ask you, you know, you heard me ask a question to Mr. Duclos earlier, asking about the Canada aerospace industry, which has been spoken about, and he didn't have an opportunity to really answer that in depth. I'm wondering if you can share your thoughts on what that would look like, if there's any talks of, you know, putting any kind of structure in place, and what your hopes would be for that kind of a strategy.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. So maybe I'll go back to the planning piece that I spoke about earlier and try to match it with what could an aerospace strategy look like. If we had good planning, and the planning for me is just that sometimes there's an expectation that, okay, this is going into procurement where we're just a short time frame away of getting our equipment. But you know, buying a sophisticated helicopters or a sophisticated aircraft or even a remotely piloted aircraft system takes time. So that planning for me is critical. So for me, that planning would actually feed the strategy. So because we need to give industry the time to prepare the grounds for the investment that Canada and the procurements that Canada is about to make. If we don't give them the time, they won't be ready for the procurements that are coming. So for me, a key part of the strategy would be that. It would enable them to invest, to plan and invest properly in what's coming. It would also give them time to establish themselves a relationship that they need to establish, and then be ready when the go time comes and PSPC releases a draft RFP or an RFP. And I'm not sure, Siobhan, if you want to. Okay.
Thank you. Mr. Duclos also spoke about interoperability and the fact that we could be, or I guess my hope is that we could be pushing and promoting our industry outside of Canada. And because within NATO and with our partners, we like to be able to operate in similar ways, and we want to be using similar equipment. Oftentimes, Canadian equipment isn't necessarily promoted or the one to be used, except in the case that he mentioned recently with I guess the icebreakers. But I'm wondering, in general, what are some other ways that we can help our companies thrive within those partnerships? And you know, I've heard also from companies in my writing that NATO often invites them to have, you know, to showcase their talents and to showcase what capabilities they produce. How can our government do better in helping those actually become, I guess, materialize into procurement from other countries?
So maybe I could take that question. Thanks very much, Mr. Chair, for the question. So our colleagues at National Defence are going to be leading a defence industrial strategy. That was mentioned by the Minister. And so that is a key place where some of that work and thinking can happen, and linking it up to an export strategy. But one thing to note with NATO is that increasingly they're moving towards joint requirement setting, joint procurements and collaboration, and that is an important place where Canadian companies can get plugged in to international collaborative efforts. And so that's one thing collectively that we're working on.
Thank you. 1 minute left. Okay. I have heard that there are issues in terms of, there are some great capabilities here. Companies go, they showcase their stuff, and they get really good feedback from other countries. And basically they're told, well, go see your Canadian reps here and they can help you, move it along the ladder. And then it's very difficult for them to actually find those reps. So what can we do to improve that situation, and who would be in charge of that?
Thanks very much for the question, Mr. Chair. So great question. And so we have different systems in place internationally through either trade commissioners or through defense attaches. I think one thing that in the work that I've been leading and been working with other government departments as well as consulting with allies about what they do, we recognize that that's a gap and that we can do much better there. So we are looking at that in the context of the review, and also working with the NATO Support and Procurement Agency and other efforts, as I mentioned before, through NATO to see how we can make it easier for our companies to be able to find points of access into those international opportunities. Thanks.
Madame Laropoulos. The last question of Madame Normandine in 2024, the Defense Committee, 2.5 minutes.
En personne.
In person, at least. I'd like to hear you speak about the number of approvals required in an approval process. I know it's an interesting question. Talk to us about whatever you feel like. Should we be giving more latitude to lower-level public servants for easier procurement? Should we reduce the number of departments? Apparently, this puts a brake on procurement. Thank you very much for your question, Mr. Chairman. Once again, excellent question. Because, again, I would say, to put it in context, each procurement process is not created similarly. Sometimes things go very fast with 3 or 4 key decisions made, and sometimes it's richer and it has to come back again and again and again. So I'd say that with the defense procurement strategy, the governance I mentioned earlier, there are 3 basic decision-making levels. There's the decision where we engage the industry and we begin pre-solicitation activities. And then there's the decision where we decide on the procurement strategy. And that's a big one. And that's where you can get 2 A's, 2 B's, and 2 C's. Sometimes there may be things that come back. And then the time comes to award the contract. Usually we look at the assessments. There's another big decision to be made with the award, what we have in place, and so on. Those are the decisions of the governance process. Now, of course, there are the decisions made for projects at national defense. You probably add another 3 at that level, because there's the Defense Capability Board, Program Management Board, an independent review panel on defense acquisition. When everything's in place on our side, we have to go before Treasury Board. And I would say that for complex projects, and I'll get back to my favorite one, the Canadian surface ship, there's a big definition contract that precedes implementation contract, which also needs everything I just mentioned before it can become implemented. I'd say that what I'm describing may look a bit intimidating. I'd say that when people are at the table and we execute these things properly, it is effective and efficient.
In terms of that, going back to that transparency around procurement and the national security exemption, one of the things that we could do, and one of the things I had put forward, was the option to mirror the policy of the United States. So when they use, or there's an idea that they would use that national security exemption and it's triggered to sole source, the Government Accountability Office automatically begins a review of the purchase. Have there been any considerations made by the department in order to increase that transparency in terms of those initiatives, and when those purchases are made under a national security exemption and it is sole source, to create far more transparency in a way like the Americans have.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. I think my bottom line upfront answer is no. I think I'm not tracking an initiative or an effort to mirror what the United States are doing. I must say we apply, like I mentioned before, the national security exception to a portion of our procurements. That recommendation, that decision is made with a lot of things in consideration, and I find within government, it's fairly well executed, and we apply it diligently. The GCRs will continue to apply, so I'm not aware of an effort to step out of the boundaries of this current execution.
Certainly you could understand that there is a desire to increase that transparency, that accountability, especially certainly from, taxpayers, but industry themselves. And so are there any steps around that to ensure that, because there were specific concerns around the consistent use of the exemption and the sole sourcing, where we could get away from that? Are there any other plans to increase that transparency?
En 30 secondes.
Oui, merci beaucoup pour la question.
Thank you very much for the question, Mr. Chairman. Madam Chairman. I answer in French or English?
And I'm not sure if I'm capturing what you want me to say here. Consistency is the number one thing that I look at when we review national security exception. And most of the time, I will go back to the list of current projects that have an NSC, and I'll compare if we're talking the same language. I think your point about transparency, I think there's some improvement that could be done with respect to transparency, but at the larger scale of defense procurement overall. And I think some of the things that we want to do, that we have in motion, will increase that transparency and the communication.
Je vais devoir vous interrompre.
I'm going to have to interrupt you, Mr. Page.
Mes excuses.
Aucun problème.
I apologize. No problem. Before I go forward, I want to make sure we have everyone's consent to continue, despite the bells, till the last round. Consent, we can continue? Okay, wonderful. Mr. Bizan, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks to the witnesses for being here. Mr. Page, can you just confirm whether or not the surface combatant design has been finalized? Or are they still kicking around?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. So, no, the Canadian surface combatant design has not been finalized, but it has been brought to a really good level of maturity, and at a level with a bit more work to do here ahead of the full rate production cut steel.
So how many years have we been in design phase?
Yeah, so I'll just, I think, approximately 5. And Mr. Chair, just so it's understood, the design of the Canadian surface combatant will last well past the full rate production cut steel, and it is smart to do so. You cannot expect to lock something before you start platform number 1 and bring this when you have 200 plus systems being integrated and many things in play.
Okay, thank you. When we did our procurement study here, one thing that we heard from many, many witnesses is that PSBC and DND have a culture of risk aversion. So instead of being risk evaders, how we turn everybody into risk takers?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair, and maybe I'll also let my colleague ADM Hardy speak about that and some of the work that she's doing. I must say again, speaking for having been the ADM at PSPC for the last 4 years, we are very much an organization that looks at every variables around the procurement. But I'd like to think that we have taken some risk in the last few years with respect to some of our procurement, and it has paid off. So I think we are sensing that the operational urgency of doing things differently, and that has the risk adversity piece being assessed and being managed accordingly.
Okay, can I just keep on, because I got a number of questions here. In the procurement review process that you're undertaking right now, when will you be consulting the defense industry on how to improve it?
Thanks very much for the question, Mr. Chair. So I have been consulting, so on a more bilateral basis. Did that starting kind of late last year and into the spring, up to the summer, and then started working on our recommendations. But in the context of the defense industrial strategy that my colleagues at National Defense will be leading with Minister Blair, there will be additional consultations.
So when you're saying bilateral, you're talking just to the major companies that right now are supplying?
Companies and the industry associations and appearing at meetings, and I've been very
So you've been talking to CATSI and others?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
When you were talking about using UORs and NSCs, if we're going to do a UOR, why don't we just do an NSC, a national security exemption, in place of an urgent order for request?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. So I would say that, again, case by case, some UORs may be not necessitating a national security exception. And we will examine the requirement just like we do for a larger procurement. So just right now, what's the thresholds that National Defense has that they can actually go and procure themselves before they have to go to PSPC? What's that level? You mean in terms of money?
Money, yeah.
Yeah, actually, I wrote it down because so at National Defense, for a competitive requirement, they can go up to 7.5 million.
7.5, that's it?
That's it.
When was the last time that was increased?
I don't have that.
Would you be able to get that for us and send it back in writing? I appreciate that very much. That seems awful low, especially when you look at anything else. The munition supply program, we're hearing from industry that it's taken forever to get orders signed, direction from the government to expand it. We see growth in munitions, especially in the 155s, that are happening under U.S. orders, but not necessarily much increase from the Canadian standpoint. In meetings that I've had with U.S. officials, including at Halifax, they want Canada to be a reliable supplier, especially in the sides of munitions, ammo, and rockets. How do we make sure that those are taken care of under MSP?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Minister Chair. And the munition supply program is actually an effective tool. It's a strategic program where we can actually, to the question I had before about planning ahead, we can do some of that. I won't say it's perfect, and actually we just conducted an evaluation of the program, and we're going to take some of the recommendations and we're going to put them forward. But just to give you a bit of an appreciation within the MSP itself, in 2023, there were over $470 million expended on various types of ammunition, from small, medium, large caliber, 9 millimeters, 25 millimeters, and larger caliber. I think ammunition at the moment is getting a bit of a sour assessment because of the 155 millimeter ammunition that we want to produce domestically. Again, to my planning piece, this is not easy. And telling industry we need an end-to-end produce in the country 155 artillery round does not happen in weeks. So there's infrastructure investment required. There's technical data packages that need to be procured from the United States. There's all kinds of things that need to be done from a resource point of view before you're in a position to do that.
That's a very important response to that question. If there's something you wish to add to it, please write to the committee. This is coming up all the time. Final 5 minutes. I think we're starting with Mr. Pawlowski.
Yeah, I think I was going to start and you're going to finish. When the Canadian government purchases something, I would think for the most part we would far prefer to spend our money within Canada. It's Canadian taxpayer money. I know with other purchases that it's not always just the cheapest product. There's also considerations of economic impact, environmental footprint. Is that factored in when defense procures something? And then the question, further question to that, if it is that consistent with our international trade obligations, or is that considered a hidden trade barrier, which I would assume we fudge it somehow to get by, that we still factor those things in when we make a choice about procurement?
I can. Thanks very much for the question, Mr. Chair. So in a very general sense, all of those factors are taken into consideration, and that's part of the defense procurement strategy from 2014. So defense would consider those. ADM Page mentioned earlier that one step in the process is selecting the procurement strategy. So all the factors you mentioned would go into that, and taking account of what our industrial base is able to produce. But there's other considerations like controlled goods or interoperability, some other items that the committee mentioned in posing questions to us. So all of those things are put on the table when making, and the question of timing. Thank you.
And the question of that being, would that be considered a hidden trade barrier in terms of international trade?
So we have to respect our trade agreements, absolutely. But the committee's already asked questions about national security exception. That we have that, and there's obviously trade implications, and other countries face the same considerations.
Okay. Well, just to tidy up here, one of the problems with defense procurement is sticker shock. And I don't think we do a very good job at disaggregating sticker shock, because it's first of all, it's an issue with respect to the initial thought of what this might cost, and I appreciate you declining to answer Mr. Stewart's question because there's a kind of a prematurity to it. But the second part is that the PBO and the AG start to weigh in, and they get into life sustainment, life cycle costs. And, what starts out as a $20 billion acquisition ends up as $60 billion by the time you figure all of this in. Has there been any thought to alleviating sticker shock and the heart attacks that collectively go across the nation when we announce a procurement?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. I think there has been some thought. I think there has been some discussion. I think to my earlier point about communicating differently and being transparent, there's some overlap here. I think it would be smart and wise to look at this with a different lens. And an early assessment could be described exactly as such. It's an early estimate that was derived by using parametric variables and according to what we know at this time. This will be a 25-year procurement. Things will change, and we'll manage accordingly. Where I think, for me, to my earlier point, where I think the real accountability and the real precision should start surfacing in a different language, i.e. no longer an estimate, is when we sign contracts.
Yeah.
So as we approach our time to sign contracts, bring submissions to Treasury Board, then these numbers are well derived. There's a lot of accuracy. So hold us then accountable to our contract and ask from us to get the best contract possible instead of playing guesswork 10 years ahead of delivering something.
Thank you for that. And on behalf of the committee, I want to thank you for your 2 hours here. Appreciate it. And colleagues, we're going to meet again Tuesday. D&D and possibly VAC will be. VAC is confirmed, yeah. VAC is confirmed. We'll be here to talk about contaminated sites. With that, meeting adjourned.